Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Captain America Civil War. This review will contain spoilers for the movie, so if you haven't seen this movie yet, you may not want to watch this video until such a time that you have. If you want to hear my spoiler-free thoughts on the movie, you can check out my Facebook page where I give my quick thoughts on the movie. I wasn't originally planning on doing this review, but I wanted to real quick give my thoughts on the movie because it's quite different from what I'm hearing from a lot of the other critics, and I wanted to go more in depth, so I'm not going to bother to try to beat around the bush, and we'll go right into spoilers. So, I think it's fair to say that Captain America Winter Soldier is one of my favorite, if not favorite, comic book movies, and Captain America Civil War is done by the same directors and creative team, so I expected a lot from this movie, and the positive, glowing reviews it got only reinforced that expectations, with many people saying it's just as good as the Winter Soldier, if not better. So, did it hold up to these high expectations? No. That's not to say it was a horrible movie. I still thought it was a really good movie for a comic book movie, and it did have some of the same quality from Winter Soldier that I enjoyed. And overall, I really liked this movie, and I would say I enjoyed it a lot more than many other comic book movies, such as Avengers: Age of Ultron. But I had some major issues with the plot that really held this movie back for me, so I don't really, hear anyone else talking about these, so I just wanted to mention it in this video. So, I'm not going to beat around the bush. Let me just start with the biggest issue that I had with this movie, which is a major spoiler, and that is the motivation of the main villain of the movie. So, throughout the movie, we're led to believe this guy is an agent of Hydra and is trying to get his hands on some super soldiers, but then we find out he's just a guy who lost his family in the events of Age of Ultron, on which he blames the Avengers, and he knew he couldn't take on the Avengers directly, so it was his plan to turn them against each other. I'm sorry, but that plot twist has a ridiculous amount of flaws. I'm amazed no one is calling it out on how unbelievably flawed this is. First, let's start with the fact that this guy was acting like a really skilled assassin, spy, all this stuff to be able to torture people for information, have knowledge of top secret information regarding Hydra, and be able to hide from the authorities to set up bombs and convincingly frame people for these crimes. And he's just some guy who lost his family. I'm sorry, but that is some major bullshit right there. Secondly, his whole plot was dependent on the Avengers thinking that he was going for the other Winter Soldiers to lure them so he could show Tony Stark a tape of the Winter Soldier killing his parents. So how did he know that Iron Man and Winter Soldier would even be there together? Because Iron Man almost wasn't even there. It was just going to be Captain America and Bucky. So that's just such a happy circumstances for him, isn't it? And why all the subterfuge? Why pretend to go after the Winter Soldiers? Why not just email them the tape when they're together? And isn't it such a happy coincidence that these accords with the government oversight just so happen to be happening at the same time to set up his plan, and that the Avengers were already split and at odds with each other? I mean, I know what they were trying to do, so, as going along with the theme of collateral damage and someone who can't let the anger and need for revenge go, and so they want to have this, need for revenge of the person who killed their loved ones consume them, such as Tony Stark with his parents and the Black Panther with his father, and it turned out the main villain as well. But the whole thing was so poorly executed, it immediately bothered me to the point that while I was watching in the theaters, I was just like, whoa, hold on there. Seriously? Plus, it really annoyed me that the other Winter Soldiers were just a red red herring that they were ultimately irrelevant to the plot. But more than that, I simply did not buy the whole thing. Felt way too contrived. And please, I do not want to hear the excuse that it's a comic book movie. That is no real excuse. Comic book movies shouldn't be given a pass on flaws this huge. It's bad writing done for plot convenience, plain and simple. The fact that it's a comic book movie does not excuse it in the least. So now let me get into the whole Captain America versus Iron Man thing. Now, I heard from many critics that the good thing about this movie is that you can see the point of view from both of them, and neither one is in the right or the wrong, and that's what makes this movie so complex. But maybe it's just me, but I was 100% on Team Cap, and thought Tony Stark was completely in the wrong. I can see the political analogy this film is trying to make regarding collateral damage and how innocents can die in wars, where people's intentions are good. And in real life, I'm a strong supporter of government regulation and oversight. But because of the specifics presented in this movie, it was quite obvious that what they were suggesting with the government oversight in this particular case was a bad idea, and that Iron Man was being really thick-headed by not seeing that. As in the case of the Avengers, if they did nothing, the loss of lives would be worse or higher, so it seems quite ridiculous to me that people would blame the Avengers for killing people who would have died anyway had they did nothing. Which is quite different than the analogy they're going for with collateral damage in real war, which is a whole different situation, but I don't want to get too much into real life political situations in this movie review. The idea was first introduced in the MCU in Jessica Jones when someone tried to punish her for what the Avengers did, and even then I thought this was a ridiculous storyline and didn't like how they pursued it. However, that's not to say I completely didn't like it. I do think it raised some really interesting moral dilemmas, and I liked how it made these movies feel more realistic, that there's a consequence for people's actions. And I thought it made total sense that Tony Stark would be feeling guilty about it. I particularly liked the line he said about how we dropped the building on this young man with a bright future who has a lot ahead of him while we were kicking ass. So I did like this moral dilemma, and I don't get me wrong, at the heart of it, I do think there was a strong case to be made for the Avengers to re-examine the consequences of their actions. I just felt, because of the specifics of this case, Team Iron Man was being really naive, as they weren't looking at the specifics, as it was beyond obvious that this government guy, whatever, had an agenda to co-opt the Avengers for his own nefarious purposes, and that Captain America had a point about how S.H.I.E.L.D. had been corrupted by Hydra, and especially as this movie went on, when Captain America had the evidence that Bucky was being framed and there was more to what was happening to them here, Iron Man just ignored it all and was being thick-headed, and at that stage I was firmly with Team Cap, and I was really against Iron Man. However, by the end of this movie, I completely hated Iron Man and all who sided with him, and think that they're all in the wrong with what happened when he found out it was the Winter Soldier who killed his parents. Now, I've heard some people try to defend him here and say, you'd probably act the same way if you just watched a tape of your parents being killed and their killer was standing right next to you. And it's true, I wouldn't know how I'd truly react until put into that situation myself. However, my best guess is, and what I really hope, is that I wouldn't be stupid enough to attack someone who I knew was just being mind controlled by someone else, and would rather direct my anger towards the person who was in control. So I'm sorry, but all of my sympathy for Iron Man went straight out the door when he went berserk, even trying to kill his own friend in order to get revenge on a tool who was brainwashed, rather than being mad at the mastermind, and plus allowing himself to be so obviously manipulated by the guy in the booth who was obviously wanted this to happen. I'm sorry, but fuck Iron Man. This movie has succeeded in fully making me hate Iron Man, but that's just how I look at it. And another flaw I wanted to talk about is the introduction of Spider-Man. Many critics seem to be praising this introduction as being great and flawless, but I'm sorry, I'm going to have to disagree. Now, I like Spider-Man himself. He was an interesting enough character, although I do think they made him a bit too naive and whiny, but that's a minor complaint. Really, ultimately, he's fine. I liked him. But my issue was more with his introduction, which I felt was very obviously shoehorned in and felt out of place. In contrast, though, the introduction of the Black Panther I thought worked really well for the plot, and I totally bought it, and it blended seamlessly into the overall plot. But the introduction of Spider-Man felt almost like an afterthought and served no actual purpose in the story itself, other than to introduce the next Spider-Man movie. It felt like the movie was saying, okay, now it's time to take 10 minutes intermission from Captain America movie so we can set up the next Spider-Man movie. It was totally unnecessary, and having Spider-Man in the movie ultimately didn't add anything to the movie at all. It would have worked better had Spider-Man already had his own movie first, like Ant-Man did, or we already knew people like Hawkeye, who did seem to just pop up out of nowhere, but that was fine because we already knew who these characters were. So try to introduce a character whom we didn't know, at least not this newest iteration, so hastily where they had to halt the movie to do it really bothered me. And while I thought the big battle at the airport where Team Captain America and Team Iron Man clashed was exciting and a great fight scene, it did lose some tension because of the fact that you knew no one would get hurt. I mean, yeah, War Machine did, but everyone was shocked about that. So in other words, it had this comic book problem where none of the characters can die, and it felt a bit more like a silly comic book romp rather than a serious action sequence with real stakes, such as what was featured in The Winter Soldier. But I don't want you to misunderstand me here. I actually really like this movie, as I mentioned before, much more than many other comic book movies. It's just everyone else is singing this movie's praises, so I don't really feel the need to point out what's great about this movie because everyone else is doing it for me. But there was a lot about this movie I liked, such as the rich moral dilemmas presented and how everything was more complex and not simple black and white, good versus evil, and some of the action sequences were quite amazing, and I thought Captain America's personal dilemma was executed very well. So my rating for Captain America Civil War out of 10 is a 7, very good. It was a fun, entertaining movie. I definitely recommend watching it. But let's be real here, this isn't like one of the best movies of all time. It had a lot of flaws that held it back. So that's it for my review of Captain America Civil War, which was the first movie on my list of summer movies to watch. As just like last year, I made a list of 10 movies being released over the summer that I would watch. So at the end of the summer, I'll make a top 10 video rating these movies, these 10 movies that I will see in order from my least favorite to my favorite. So be sure to keep an eye out for that, and also check out my channel for many more videos on shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Fear the Walking Dead, Orphan Black, and more, and make sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.